Such was his influence upon her, that she, who had scoffed at the wisest woman in the whole world, and derided the wishes of her own father and mother, came at length to regard this dog as a superior being, and to look up to him as well as love him. And this was best of all. The improvement upon her in the course of a month was plain. She had quite ceased to go into passions, and had actually begun to take a little interest in her work, and try to do it well. Still, the change was mostly an outside one. I do not mean that she was pretending. Indeed, she had never been given to pretence of any sort. But the change was not in her, only in her mood. A second change of circumstances would have soon brought a second change of behaviour, and so long as that was possible she continued the same sort of person she had always been. But if she had not gained much, a trifle had been gained for her, a little quietness and order of mind, and hence a somewhat greater possibility of the first idea of right arising in it, whereupon she would begin to see what a wretched creature she was, and must continue until she herself was right. Meanwhile, the wise woman had been watching her when she least fancied it, and taking note of the change that was passing upon her. Out of the large eyes of a gentle sheep she had been watching her, a sheep that puzzled the shepherd, for every now and then she would appear in his flock, and he would catch sight of her 2 or 3 times in a day, sometimes for days together, yet he never saw her when he looked for her, and never when he counted the flock into the fold at night. He knew she was not one of his, but where could she come from, and where could she go to? For there was no other flock within many miles, and he never could get near enough to her to see whether or not she was marked. Nor was Prince at the least used to him for the unravelling of the mystery, for although, as often as he told him to fetch the strange sheep, he went bounding to her at once, it was only to lie down at her feet. At length, however, the wise woman had made up her mind, and after that the strange sheep no longer troubled the shepherd. As Rosamond improved, the shepherdess grew kinder. She gave her all Agnes's clothes, and began to treat her much more like a daughter. Hence she had a great deal of liberty after the little work required of her was over, and would often spend hours at a time with the shepherd, watching the sheep and the dogs, and learning a little from seeing how Prince, and the others as well, managed their charge, how they never touched the sheep that did as they were told, and turned when they were bid, but jumped on a disobedient flock, and ran along their backs, biting and barking, and half choking themselves with mouthfuls of their wool. Then also she would play with the brooks, and learn their songs, and build bridges over them, and sometimes she would be seized with such delight of heart that she would spread out her arms to the wind, and go rushing up the hill till her breath left her, when she would tumble down in the heather, and lie there till it came back again. A noticeable change had by this time passed also on her countenance. Her coarse shapeless mouth had begun to show a glimmer of lines and curves about it, and the fat had not returned with the roses to her cheeks, so that her eyes looked larger than before, while, more noteworthy still, the bridge of her nose had grown higher, so that it was less of the impudent, insignificant thing inherited from a certain great-great-great-grandmother, who had little else to leave her. For a long time it had fitted her very well, for it was just like her, but now there was ground for alteration, and already the granny who gave it would not have recognised it. It was growing a little like a Prince's, and Prince's was a long, perceptive, sagacious nose, one that was seldom mistaken. One day about noon, while the sheep were mostly lying down, and the shepherd, having left them to the care of the dogs, was himself stretched under the shade of a rock a little way apart, and the Princess sat knitting, with Prince at her feet, lying in wait for a snap at a great fly, for even he had his follies, Rosamond saw a poor woman come toiling up the hill, but took little notice of her until she was passing a few yards off, when she heard her utter the dog's name in a low voice. Immediately on the summons, Prince started up and followed her, with hanging head but gently wagging tail. At first the Princess thought he was merely taking observations, and consulting with his nose whether she was respectable or not, but she soon saw that he was following her in meek submission. Then she sprung to her feet and cried, "Prince! Prince!" But Prince only turned his head and gave her an odd look, as if he were trying to smile and could not. Then the Princess grew angry and ran after him, shouting, "Prince, come here directly!" Again Prince turned his head, but this time to growl and show his teeth. The Princess flew into one of her forgotten rages, and picking up a stone flung it at the woman. Prince turned and darted at her, with fury in his eyes and his white teeth gleaming. At the awful sight the Princess turned also, and would have fled, but he was upon her in a moment, and threw her to the ground, and there she lay. It was evening when she came to herself. A cool twilight wind, that somehow seemed to come all the way from the stars, was blowing upon her. The poor woman and Prince, the shepherd, and his sheep were all gone, and she was left alone with the wind upon the heather. She felt sad, weak, and perhaps for the first time in her life a little ashamed. The violence of which she had been guilty had vanished from her spirit, and now lay in her memory with the calm morning behind it, while in front the quiet dusky night was now closing in the loud shame betwixt a double peace. Between the two her passion looked ugly. It pained her to remember. She felt it was hateful, and hers. But alas, Prince was gone. That horrid woman had taken him away. The fury rose again in her heart and raged, until it came to her mind how her dear Prince would have flown at her throat if he had seen her in such a passion. The memory calmed her, and she rose and went home. There perhaps she would find Prince, for surely he could never have been such a silly dog as to go altogether away with a strange woman. She opened the door and went in. Dogs were asleep all about the cottage, it seemed to her, but nowhere was Prince. She crept away to her little bed and cried herself to sleep. In the morning the shepherd and shepherdess were indeed glad to find she had come home, for they thought she had run away. "Where is Prince?" she cried, the moment she waked. "His mistress has taken him," answered the shepherd. Was that woman his mistress? "I fancy so. He followed her as if he had known her all his life. I'm very sorry to lose him, though." The poor woman had gone close past the rock where the shepherd lay. He saw her coming and thought of the strange sheep which had been feeding beside him when he lay down. "Who can she be?" he said to himself. But when he noted how Prince followed her, without even looking up at him as he passed, he remembered how Prince had come to him. And this was how. As he lay in bed one fierce winter morning, just about to rise, he heard the voice of a woman call to him through the storm. "Shepherd, I have brought you a dog. Be good to him. I will come again and fetch him away." He dressed as quickly as he could and went to the door. It was half snowed up, but on the top of the white mound before it stood Prince, and now he had gone as mysteriously as he had come, and he felt sad. Rosamond was very sorry too, and hence, when she saw the looks of the shepherd and shepherdess, she was better able to understand them, and she tried for a while to behave better to them because of their sorrow, so the loss of the dog brought them all nearer to each other. End of chapter 9. Recording by Nathan at antipodeanwriter.wordpress.com.